Fred Pampel completed all of his college degrees at the University of Illinois, from a 1973 BA in sociology to his 1977 PhD degree. He started his academic career at the University of Iowa, where he spent the next 14 years rising through the ranks to become a full professor. During this period, he took a leave of absence to spend 1 year at Florida State University's Institute on Aging. In 1995, he moved to the University of Colorado at Boulder, where he continues as a research professor in sociology. This paper was written shortly after he arrived at the University of Colorado, in the same period when he spent a research and teaching visit at the London School of Economics. In this article, Pampel attempts to generalize Easterlin's argument about how relative cohort size affects conditions experienced by different generations, testing this perspective with comparative data from a variety of Western European countries. He tries to show that the strength of the cohort effects suggested by Easterlin depend on structural features of the political and economic institutions in different countries.
Of potential cyclic trends in birth rates, driven by alternating large and small cohorts of young adults, as suggested by Easterlin's relative cohort size theory, resonated with many scholars and generated a whole cottage industry of research trying to test his ideas in different contexts. The relative cohort size, or RCS hypothesis, eventually even made its way into the popular vocabulary as media pundits wrote feature stories based on what to expect if Easterlin's predictions came true. After all, we can see changes in relative cohort size coming, so to speak. Relative cohort size only refers to people in the working ages. So if we start the working ages at age 15, there are always about 15 years of younger people already present in the population. So we know how many of them will be arriving in the working ages for at least a decade and a half into the future. This means we can predict relative cohort size at least that far ahead. Easterlin recommended constructing a measure of relative cohort size that compared the numbers of older and younger workers in the labor force. For example, we can add up everyone between ages 30 and 64, the older segment of the working ages, and put them into the numerator. Add up all the people between ages 15 and 29, the younger segment of the working ages, and put them into the denominator. Since there are 7 5-year age groups in the numerator of this ratio and only 3 age groups in the denominator, we would expect this ratio normally to be larger than 1, maybe around 2. But if birth rates rise and fall dramatically, as they did during the 20th century in the United States, the size of new cohorts of people entering the labor force also rises and falls some years later. The result is variations in the relative cohort size ratio. For example, in the 1960s, the small birth cohorts from the years of the Great Depression and World War II arrived in the young working ages in the denominator of the ratio. So the ratio rose to levels at least as high or higher than 2. These small cohorts, as Easterlin pointed out, also married early and had lots of children because they enjoyed less competition and better career opportunities early in life. In sharp contrast, once these small cohorts moved up to ages above 30 in the numerator of the ratio, and huge new cohorts of baby boomers also arrived in the young worker ages, the measure of relative cohort size dropped below 1.5 older workers per younger worker. As the relative cohort size measure dropped, the total fertility rate measuring births also dropped right along with it. These parallel trends were the basis for Easterlin's theory linking the two. The fact that we can see relative cohort size coming for at least 15 years into the future means that Easterlin also could predict that this measure would be rising again as baby boomers started to move up into the numerator as ages 30 or older, and the smaller cohorts of Generation X began entering the young working ages. Based on this look ahead, Easterlin went out on a limb and predicted that birth rates would begin to rise again along with the RCS measure. This should have meant rising birth rates in the 1980s. As Pampel points out at the start of his article, birth rates definitely did not start rising again in the 1980s. Relative cohort size increased as we knew it would, but birth rates remained flat throughout the decade. Does this mean that Easterlin's theory was disproved and should be rejected? When people began to point out this problem in the 1980s and 1990s, as birth rates remained low when they should have been rising, some scholars indeed suggested that the whole Easterlin hypothesis was wrong, and that the parallels he had noticed were just a historical coincidence, and that we should not expect the pattern to persist. Easterlin himself even tried to make excuses for low birth rates, for example, saying that maybe the baby boomers were having so much trouble moving up in their careers that they were still hanging around in the entry-level jobs and creating competition for the new Generation X members arriving on the scene. This is sort of cheating, because he also claimed originally that the career tracks in the labor force prevent different generations of workers from competing directly with each other. On the other hand, neither Easterlin nor his critics, nor even Pampel for that matter, consider the idea that migration started up again in the mid-1960s and that young immigrants may have added competition that short-circuited the expected benefits of being in the smaller Generation X cohorts once they reached the working ages. The divergence of the two series in the 1980s, though, did make Pampel question the Easterlin hypothesis. Other reactions about Easterlin's original publications included many articles that tried looking for evidence about relative cohort size effects outside the United States. Since Europe is full of lots of little countries, each with their own economies and laws and populations, it is always available as a kind of natural test tube for testing theories about what causes what in a population. Pampel reviewed several of these studies testing Easterlin's hypothesis in European and other countries, and discovered some very mixed results. In some cases, patterns that looked a lot like the relative cohort size effects Easterlin noticed in the United States did show up in these other countries. For example, a French scholar who constructed graphs using Easterlin's method shows us a very similar pattern of parallel trends in relative cohort size and fertility rates in Finland. But in the majority of the countries he examined, this pattern did not hold true. The Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany as it was called before reunification, provided a dramatic example of this lack of parallel trends, as illustrated by the graph drawn by Jean-Claude Chesnay. In West Germany, birth rates went up pretty much whenever relative cohort size was falling instead of rising, and went down again whenever relative cohort size was rising instead of falling. This pattern is the complete opposite of what Easterlin would have predicted, a reversal that echoes the very different trends that I observed in communist Eastern Europe. Do these inconsistent results across the countries of Europe prove that Easterlin was wrong? Based on his review of these European results, Pampel came to a very different conclusion. When he asked himself why it might seem that sometimes Easterlin was right, but then when we looked at the next country it might seem that he was wrong, Pampel decided that we simply might not be looking at the whole picture. There might be some other systematic differences between the countries where Easterlin was right and where his theory didn't fit. The causal chain of circumstances that Easterlin laid out ran from changes in relative cohort size to economic consequences of entering the labor force as part of a large or small generation, and from there to resulting low or high birth rates as a reaction to those economic consequences. Pampel's idea is that there may be differences between the studied countries that somehow affect whether or not cohort size actually turns out to produce certain economic consequences for people when they get to the working ages. Is a big generation always an equally large problem for its members? What sort of differences between countries might explain why a large cohort runs into more problems in one context than in another? We turn next to this question. Pampel looks around for features of different countries that could modify how relative cohort size affects people's economic situations, and therefore also their decisions about childbearing. He starts with government economic policies. For nearly a century, we have recognized naturally occurring cycles of boom and bust, or expansion and contraction, in free market capitalistic economies. Nikolai Kondratiev's name is now attached to these long waves in prices and income that seem to repeat 2 or 3 times per century. The Great Depression of the 1930s was right on track as one of the troughs in these waves, as were previous downturns in the 1890s and 1850s. The latest wave reached a high point shortly before 2000, and the Great Recession just before 2010 was right on track again as the most recent Kondratiev trough. These waves are about twice as long as the Kuznets cycles that Easterlin studied. When a country adopts a laissez-faire policy of just letting such long swings run their course, as was the case historically in the United States, there's no point to look for anything like an Easterlin effect of relative cohort size on earnings, employment, family formation, or birth rates. The naturally occurring long swings in the economy are far more powerful than relative cohort size and wash out any such possible patterns. Once the Great Depression or the Great Recession hit the U.S. economy during the 20th century, it no longer made the slightest difference whether there were more or fewer people than normal entering the potential labor force. If prices and income rise and fall in these naturally occurring waves, they determine the fortunes of people caught up in them, regardless of age, sex, or generation size. But in the 20th century, some economists decided that it might be possible to fight back against these long-term boom and bust cycles. Reacting to the devastation of the Great Depression in the 1930s, John Maynard Keynes in England proposed that it would be desirable to interfere with such cycles by deliberate government policies to try to smooth out the booms and busts into a more consistent, steady pattern of growth. During a recession, the government should try to cushion the fall in prices and incomes and stimulate the economy toward more growth. During a boom, the government should try to rein in inflation of prices and keep the engine of the economy from overheating. To do this, economists following this line of thought have developed two types of tools: monetary policy, which we might describe as the first line of defense against the boom and bust cycles, and fiscal policy as the ultimate line of defense. During a boom, monetary policy can raise interest rates and take money out of circulation by having the central bank, or in the United States, the Federal Reserve, lend less money to banks. This is supposed to put the brakes on economic growth and reduce inflation. During the bust or recession on the other end of the cycle, we can lower interest rates and put more money into circulation so that people have easier access to cheaper credit and can afford to start and expand businesses and hire unemployed workers. In case the monetary policies aren't strong enough to rebalance the economy, the government can resort to fiscal policies involving the money brought in by taxes and spent on government programs. During the Great Depression in the 1930s, these fiscal policies included massive programs of government jobs on public works projects to give workers paychecks so that they could buy things and stimulate the economy to start producing them again. The government tries to tinker with the engine of the economy and keep it running smoothly instead of bouncing over the rough terrain of booms and recessions. Easterlin himself suggested that this is when you might expect the secondary effects of something like relative cohort size to become noticeable. He's clear about recognizing that there was no hint of any relative cohort size effects in the United States in the late 19th or early 20th century before the Great Depression. This was not just because immigration was canceling out advantages or disadvantages of cohort size, but also because the government was doing nothing to prevent the natural boom and bust cycles in the economy, next to which relative cohort size is pretty much irrelevant. Pampel goes Easterlin one better on this point. He looks beyond the temporary Keynesian expedient of spending your way out of a recession with government programs to consider the more permanent welfare state systems that have developed in some European countries. He does not make any judgment about whether these welfare states are a good idea or a bad idea. He only makes the point that this should have some impact on whether or not we see Easterlin-type relative cohort size effects in the birth rate. If a large generation comes along and has trouble finding jobs, the government might be able to exert some special stimulation on the economy and get the private sector to create more jobs for them. If this is not possible, at least the government can offer generous unemployment benefits so that the economic penalties of being in a large generation do not hit people as hard. In that case, they should be more willing to keep up the birth rates, despite being a large generation, and we should find only weak relative cohort size effects. So Pampel's basic hypothesis suggests that countries with more welfare state programs should show only weak Easterlin connections between cohort size, labor force consequences, and resulting birth rates. On the other hand, countries that do not go in for as many of these welfare state programs should show stronger Easterlin connections between cohort size, labor force consequences, and resulting birth rates. In fact, it begins to look as though the Easterlin cycles themselves are rather fragile patterns in terms of economic context, like clouds in the sky that only form in certain weather conditions. Prior to the Keynesian era, when governments did little or nothing to moderate the boom and bust cycles in the economy, these long swings dominated economic life, and there was no question of finding any Easterlin cycles. Once governments began tinkering with the economic engine, trying to keep growth on an even keel by damping down inflationary expansions and by trying to soften the negative aspects of recessions, then the more delicate pattern of relative cohort size effects on birth rates could emerge. But only, of course, if it was also impossible for immigration to rise or fall along with the more moderated business cycles that still appeared. As Easterlin himself suggested, this means that such Keynesian steady-state economic tinkering actually amounts to yet another precondition that must happen before we would even expect to find Easterlin cycles, linking relative cohort size to fertility trends. To carry this logic forward based on Pampel's hypothesis, once countries go beyond just temporary policy measures to moderate business cycles and start moving into welfare state territory with large government programs as a permanent part of the national economy, these government activities may once again short-circuit the connection that Easterlin drew between relative cohort size and fertility consequences. When big cohorts don't suffer such serious penalties as they try to crowd into the labor force, they may not react as strongly by delaying their marriages and births. So once again, we would not expect to see strong Easterlin cycles in this welfare state territory of the economic spectrum. We might even say that the Keynesian version of economic policy creates a kind of sweet spot within which we should expect Easterlin cycles to emerge. But outside of this range of policies, we should not expect to see an important link between relative cohort size and fertility. In addition to his core hypothesis about the spectrum of economic policy options, Pampel also tacks the issue of female labor force participation onto his explanatory perspective. He suggests that paying jobs for women also could reduce the economic penalties faced by young couples who find themselves jammed into a large cohort of people and running into trouble starting their careers. The women's additional income might make them more optimistic about the future and more willing to start a family. But the reality of life in most countries is that women also bear heavy responsibility for the care of any such children that might appear. They face a hard choice between career and family obligations. This, Pampel suggests, furnishes yet another reason why different countries might show weaker or stronger links between relative cohort size and birth rates. In countries that enact policies to reduce the conflict between jobs and parenthood, particularly subsidized daycare for working parents, Easterlin cycles should be weaker. In countries that make women choose between careers and children, Easterlin cycles should be stronger. And of course, the countries most likely to have such programs and policies are once again the same welfare states where we would expect weaker Easterlin cycles for other reasons. So Pampel has a working explanation for why some countries might show strong Easterlin cycles, while others do not. It is not that Easterlin was wrong about such connections between cohort size and birth rates, but that the cycles he describes are only to be expected in a special sort of social and economic environment. Outside of that environment, even Easterlin himself is not really predicting that such cycles should occur. We turn next to whether this conditional interpretation of the Easterlin effect turned out to be supported by Pampel's results. His hypotheses about Easterlin cycles lined up. Pampel makes them run the gauntlet of empirical analysis based on data from 18 countries. These include many countries in Western Europe, but also Japan, the United States, and Canada, the same countries where we've already seen the demographic transition mostly completed by the late 20th century. He selects these countries because he doesn't want his research about Easterlin cycles to get mixed up with the earlier broad pattern of falling birth rates at the end of the demographic transition. The outcome that he's trying to predict is the period total fertility rate in each country. Does it rise or fall depending on the passage of small and large cohorts in the age distributions of countries? To measure the positions of such small and large cohorts, he adopts Easterlin's own ratio of relative cohort size. In the numerator, we find the population at ages 30 through 64, and in the denominator, we find the population at ages 15 to 29. A high value of this ratio indicates a shortage of young workers, with smaller cohorts in the denominator and larger cohorts in the numerator. A low value of this ratio indicates large cohorts crowding into the young working ages and creating problems for themselves, while the older working ages experience lower numbers of workers. If Easterlin's model holds, the total fertility rate in a country should rise and fall along with this relative cohort size ratio, although Pampel suggests that we probably should lag the TFR values a few years behind the labor force changes to allow a little time for people to react to their changing economic fortunes in terms of decisions about marriages and births. Framing this basic linkage of relative cohort size to fertility rates, Pampel also takes account of the other factors that vary from one country to another and that he suspects might be modifying the basic Easterlin connection. These include measures of the extent of unemployment benefits available to workers in trouble, and also the extent of labor force participation by women. He admits that his measure of jobs for women has some problems because he couldn't find time series data for all his countries about whether such jobs were part-time or full-time. And this distinction could be very important for whether a woman faces trade-off decisions between jobs and motherhood. He does have at least some information about how many women in the childbearing ages have paid employment in different countries. It also includes information about fiscal policies in different countries, especially spending on Social Security and family allowances that could make it easier for women with paying jobs also to have children. He does not bother with any measures of the more subtle monetary policy options, such as trends in the efforts of different countries to influence the money supply or interest rates. He is more concerned with welfare state measures than with traditional Keynesian policies because it's the welfare state situation that he thinks might weaken the Easterlin effect. Pampel goes to elaborate lengths to measure not only specific policy measures that indicate the existence of a welfare state, but all kinds of other measurements of what he calls collectivism. This reflects the fact that he had been doing research on these kinds of measures in his previous work, so he knew a lot about them. For example, he uses one scale that measures whether a country has a lot of plural competing interest groups or what he calls a corporatist structure. He also distinguishes between political systems based on the winner-take-all principle and those where coalitions of very ideologically distinct parties must construct some kind of compromise consensus among themselves. He counts how many years countries have been controlled by leftist political parties, the extent to which they offer benefit programs to their citizens based simply on citizenship instead of requiring some means test to prove that you need the help, and a final measure of how much violence, such as riots, strikes, and other disturbances, have been disrupting each country. After testing this variety of different measures, he finds that they actually all tend to fit together into a single index that he calls the collectivism scale. This scale, with positive values that indicate more collectivism in a general sense, negative values that point to a sort of every man for himself approach to life, is normalized so that it has a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. If a country scores higher on the positive side, Pampel expects this will predict weaker Easterlin cycles linking cohort size to birth rates. If a country scores more on the negative side, this should predict stronger Easterlin cycles linking cohort size to birth rates. So when he puts all of his data from these countries into the hopper and turns the handle of the statistical machine that he has constructed, what comes out of the other end of this machine? What does he find? The results are very detailed and complicated, filling many pages of the article, but we can boil down his conclusions to two main points as far as we are concerned. First, Pampel concludes that his estimates show a modest effect of relative cohort size on fertility, averaged across all nations. This means that even when we include a bunch of welfare state economies in the mix, there is still a tendency for large cohorts to run into trouble and have slightly fewer children, and an opposite tendency for small cohorts to experience the advantages of less competition for jobs, housing, and everything else, and to have slightly more children as a result. No doubt Easterlin read through this article when it was first published and smiled to himself in his office at the University of Southern California. Perhaps he even remarked to himself, "I told you so." But the other main point that Pampel reveals is that the effect of relative cohort size on fertility is weak in countries with high collectivism scores. This means that we may indeed need to think about Easterlin cycles as conditional outcomes, patterns that only show up under a specific limiting set of conditions. From Easterlin's own work, we already know that these conditions include the existence of a competitive labor market, so that large generations are penalized for their numbers by more intense competition over jobs, and also the non-existence, so to speak, of immigration as a possible way for economies to respond to fluctuations in the need for workers. If a small cohort comes along in a competitive labor market and no immigrants can show up to spoil it for them, they should experience great career outcomes that make them optimistic and ready to have more children than usual. A large cohort coming into the same situation should experience more economic hardships and have fewer children than usual. Easterlin himself declared that such nuances of reproductive behavior would not become important until governments got around to the Keynesian attitude of trying to maintain a fairly steady rate of economic growth instead of suffering through the boom and bust cycles of the past. But Pampel now shows us that when governments go beyond this temporary tinkering stage and start constructing permanent welfare states, the Easterlin cycles begin to fade away again because cohort size no longer carries the same degree of economic penalties or bonuses that it once did. Easterlin cycles apparently happen only in the sweet spot in the middle of this spectrum of possible economic policies.